putting this together, and especially to the Chautauqua Institution. My job as the moderator today is essentially to get out of the way. I will introduce the panels. We have decided upon a slightly different format in order to take advantage of the tremendous expertise of Cherif Bassiouni. He's going to speak for longer to sort of set the stage for, in a sense, what is going on with the Arab Spring. We had a hint of that with Prince Zaid's remarks this morning, but he will go much more into depth into how that relates to our overall topic of legal accountability. And then we'll hear from Jamel, from Greta, and from Roy, who will comment on his remarks. He may wish at the end to add a few other notes, and then, of course, the audience will be invited to participate. Let me just say a couple extra things. You have the biographies of our speakers in front of you, but what you may not know is, I'm just turning right here to my right, Professor Bassiouni, who is Professor Emeritus and head of the Human Rights Institute at DePaul, also chaired the Commission of Inquiry that examined the atrocities in the former of Yugoslavia. So in a sense, the whole start of this discipline can be traced to the work of Cherif Bassiouni, who went into war zones and actually explored mass atrocities on the ground, not just in an office somewhere in New York or Geneva or in Chicago. He more recently was the special advisor on human rights in Afghanistan and chaired the Commission of Inquiry in Libya and Bahrain. So he is really quite well versed to give us quite a bit of information about the Middle East and mass atrocities more generally. Greta Barbone, who I never had the opportunity to meet before, but as I said, this is, now Greta, I'm just looking, here it is. She's with No Peace Without Justice, a Tunisian human rights activist. Again, maybe if Cherif is flying at 30,000 feet, she has been right there on the ground throughout the Middle East and the MENA countries looking at human rights issues directly. Jamel, who I just recently met, also a Tunisian human rights activist who is from, I believe, the city that Zizi was from, and will speak to exactly what is going on the ground in human rights. And then we're very delighted to have Roy Schoendorf join us who's speaking in his personal capacity, is that right? Not on behalf of his government, he's with the Israeli government, but also has a distinguished background in international human rights and mass atrocities, and will comment from that perspective. I wanted to start with a poem, and Jamel tells me if we can find the Arabic, he will read it to us in Arabic. But before turning the floor over to Cherif, this was a poem written by a Tunisian poet, Mohammed Al-Jami, who was in Qatar and was arrested for writing this poem. He's Qatari, excuse me, that's right. And he was arrested for writing this poem, and he had dedicated it to the activists in Tunisia. And I want to read it. I think it fits beautifully with what we just saw from Shabana, and the fact that each individual contributes in their own way to the project of bringing justice and human rights and dignity into conflict situations. So the poem, this is an English translation, and Jamel will hopefully read it for us in Arabic later, goes like this. Knowing that those who satisfy themselves and upset their people will tomorrow have someone else sitting in their seat, knowing that those who satisfy themselves and upset their people will have tomorrow someone else sitting in their seat. For those who think the country is in their names and their children's names, the country is for the people and its glories are theirs. Repeat with one voice, for one faith. We are all Tunisia in the face of repressive elites. We are all Tunisia in the face of repressive elites. The Arab governments and who rules them are without exception thieves. Thieves. The question that frames the thoughts of those who wonder will not find an answer in any official channels. As long as it imports everything it has from the West, why can't it import laws and freedoms? Why can't it import laws and freedoms? So this from a young activist who is currently in jail in Qatar. So with that introduction to some of the sobering and challenging issues, I turn the podium off to my dear friend and colleague from whom I have learned so much over the years and to whom we are so grateful, Cherif Bassiouni. Cherif, you have the floor.
Thank you, Leila and David and others who organized this magnificent series of international humanitarian law dialogues at Chautauqua, for organizing them and for inviting me to speak both today and tomorrow. Tomorrow was a topic that dealt with the generalities of the Arab Spring. Today it's the specificities of accountability. So it's a bit of an intellectual challenge to speak about the specificities before the generalities, but I hope you will be able to make the transition. Let me start by saying that we still call it the Arab Spring, though, as you know, the Arab Spring has fastly moved into a hot summer, and the hot summer, without any transitioning through fall, moved into a bitter winter. We are now living into the bitter winter of the Arab Spring. And it's important to keep in mind certain generalities before going into the specificities. And the first generality that probably most people who are not historians of the Arab world will probably not readily see is that the Arab world has been in a revolutionary fervor since the end of World War I. I wrote a book in 1973 called The Arab Revolution, and Arnold Toynbee was gracious enough to write the foreword to it. We were both together at Stanford University teaching at the time. I was a very, very modest young man, and he, of course, was an extraordinary luminary. But I had latched on to this idea that the Arab world was truly going through a very deep-rooted revolution. And in one of the sentences in the foreword, in my introduction to the book, I said, if Israel didn't exist at all, the Arab world would still be in torment and turmoil, because what is happening in the Arab world has nothing to do with this particular factor, which may be, like other aggravating factors, a factor, but it is not the central factor. The Arab world, if you have to look at its history, has been integrated into the Islamic nation as early as about 636, 637 for Palestine, what is now Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, 642 Egypt. By 646, it was all of North Africa. By 650, it was Mesopotamia. And then from that point on, the Arab identities, please emphasize that, of each and every Arab countries were subsumed in the Islamic identity. But as the Islamic world and its history changed, and the Muslim Ummah converted into a Muslim empire, and the empire in turn broke down into multiple different Muslim regimes, so did the Arab world go through these transformations and convulsions without ever gaining its identity. Come the Turkish Ottoman Empire, and for almost until the 15th century, in the 15th century, until the end of World War I, the Turkish Ottoman Empire dominates. During World War I, you have the beginning of the boiling of the Arab Revolution manifesting itself into Arab nationalism. And the sense of Arab nationalism which emerges is a very nationalistic sense. And you can see a vast difference between the sort of pro-intellectual French influence of the Syrian Lebanese elite in the early 1920s, as opposed to the Egyptian anti-colonial, anti-British movement, and different other manifestations of Arab nationalism arising. The movement results in a number of conflicts and finally obtaining of the independence of these countries, each one of these countries seeking its identity, only to discover that it had traded off the rulers of the Turkish Ottoman Empire to local dictators, local Ottomans, so to speak of. And from there, it moved away from colonialism only to find itself under the colonial empire of monarchies or military regimes or others. And then in the 50s comes out the idea of Arab nationalism, and a new sort of a union that links a sense of Arabism and Islamism together, tied in with a portion of a new ideology, which at the time was a mixture of socialism and Marxism, that arises together. That movement rises once again to find itself fighting the new neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism, and its remnants represented by the different tyrannical monarchies and military dictatorship that existed. Now that, in a sense, ended with the defeat of Egypt in 1967. The limited military victory of Egypt in 1973 was not an Arab manifestation. It was exclusively an Egyptian manifestation. It remained limited to that. Egypt moved in the direction of Camp David. The rest of the Arab world didn't really follow. From 78 on, Egypt was the only country, for all practical purposes, to have moved in the direction of peace with Israel. 79 comes the peace treaty with Israel. It was not until 1993 that Jordan follows with its peace treaty. Israel is still not part of the region that it is part of geographically, probably for two reasons. One, the Arab world rejects it, and two, I think the Israelis have never really opted for being part of that region. Instead, they see themselves more as an extension of the West. In the midst of that turmoil, the sense of Arab nationalism, the sense of something of a conceptual idea that ties the Arabs together sort of breaks apart. The Nasserite idea of Arab socialism, Arab nationalism quickly disappears. Local nationalism remains, but it remains more in a sentimental type of nature. It is at that point that you have to look at the different revolutionary movements, as I would call them, in each and every Arab country. You look at, for example, as we will talk about it, since it is relevant to our question today, you look at the movement in Algeria. Algeria goes through a very difficult revolutionary war, particularly during the period of 1956 in the Battle of Algiers. A country of 10 million people lost about 1 million of its people. There has never been any post-conflict justice in Algeria for the 1 million people who were lost. And the scars of that remains. What is it replaced with? A military dictatorship. What did the people gain? And so you have the only thing left at that point is the Islamic ideal. And the Islamic ideal manifests itself in the FIS, the front of the Islamic Front. It wins an election, like the Muslim Brotherhood won the election, but maybe more decisively in Algeria. The military do not allow that election to stand, and the FIS is removed from power, and the military is back in control, back repressing the freedoms of society, in the hope, however, of trying to rebuild the society. So the dilemma of Algeria is, how do you rebuild the economy, how do you rebuild the society, and yet at the same time give a little bit of democracy and freedom. The problem is, democracy and freedom is not something that you can give in small pieces. You can't be partially pregnant. If you are a woman, you're either pregnant or you're not. You either have freedom or you don't. You either have democracy or you don't. So the idea of having a military regime doling out bits and pieces of democracy and freedom never works out. It didn't work out in Algeria, and it didn't work out in other countries. In Tunisia, you have an extraordinary leader that takes Tunisia out of French colonialism. He establishes himself as president. His name is Bourguiba. At the beginning, he is highly respected and loved by his people, establishes an extraordinary policy, the only country in the world that I know of that devoted a substantial portion of its budget to national education. No army, very small budget for the army, very enlightened approach, but as Abraham Lincoln says, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so it is. After a period of time, Bourguiba becomes old and too much in power, and he too becomes corrupted and absolutely corrupted, and the people rebel. Tunisia demonstrates that an international civil society existed as of the 50s, and the international civil society rises up. And a lot of very senior intellectuals are part of the movement that removes Bourguiba, and Zain al-Abidin takes over. And there was an idea then that things were going to change, except that Zain al-Abidin, a former officer, former Minister of Interior, engages in the same type of repressions, and even worse than those that Bourguiba did. And so suddenly the people find themselves in that situation. And that is then accompanied by what is usually the case whenever you have these types of repressions. Corruption is the appendage to repression. Corruption invariably happens whenever you do not have the shining lights of transparency that democracy usually brings about, with all its faults anyway. And so suddenly the people have to find a way of rebelling against it. And they rebel. And again, it's the Islamists that win. Why? Because there is no other ideology that can prevail. The pan-Arab ideology failed. The nationalistic ideology failed. The communist ideology failed. This morning, Prince Zaid was saying we need to develop a new indigenous ideology. There is no indigenous ideology. So there is a vacuum. The only ideology that prevails is the Islamist ideology. And the Islamist ideology, and I think somebody was asking the question, the Islamist ideology is one that is, in a sense, extraordinarily, I want to use the word socialistic. The Islamic ideology is that everybody in a society is part of a society, and everybody has an obligation to provide for society. So it's a very socialistic approach. You can almost say, and I don't mean to be heretical in that respect, that you can sort of see the historic background of the tribalism that existed in the southern Arabian Peninsula. The sense of tribalism where everybody in the tribe is concerned about everybody else. Where individual rights are not that important. It's the tribal societal rights that are the most important. And in a sense, as you look at the applicability of this type of a doctrine on a nationwide basis, you find it antithetical to individual rights, and therefore antithetical to the Western approach and concept of individualism and individual rights, of freedom of the individual within a society, because it is always the collective rights that prevail. It could work very well in a most enlightened society, but in a society, again, as Prince Zaid was mentioning, which lacks substantially in human development, suddenly what you see is you see the society sinking down to its lowest common denominator. And individuals who could be emerging and who could pull the society upwards are the ones who are then now submerged and dragged down into the society, prevented from emerging, leading, and moving the society upwards. And so here we have the Tunisian revolution coming up, and the transformation takes place, and I hope that Greta and Jamil will not find what I say too troublesome, but there is a high level of discourse in Tunisia about transitional justice, even a ministry of transitional justice, but that's because Tunisia has always had a civil society and a history in human rights organization and political activism with a lot of support from the outside. Tunisia has a lot of support in Italy, in France, people who live in Italy and in France, and so all of that carries with it a certain impetus. But at the governmental level, frankly, and I'm going to borrow Brenda's style, which I'm totally in agreement with, nothing is happening. So you have a ministry for transitional justice. You don't have transitional justice. You have two major assassinations of two major political leaders. Nothing is happening. You say, well, what are we going to do? So we have one prosecution in absentia of the former president, but that's about it. What's happening to all of the other people? To all of the people in the military, in the police? Nothing. A lot of talk, nothing is happening. But at least in Tunisia, you have that voice that's there. You have the activists that are still keeping the idea alive. You move from there into Libya. I had the privilege of serving as the United Nations Commission of Inquiry in Libya as chair. The chair then passed to a member of the commission, my colleague Philippe Kirsch. I remained on it. We both consider ourselves interchangeable because we sort of think alike and work very well together. We went there, and as was said this morning, you have the ICC trying to get Saif al-Islam and al-Senussi, two fairly bad characters. Al-Senussi certainly, Saif probably is bad. We've met with al-Senussi, and what's the problem? Well, until today, in Libya, the different military groups are holding about 8,000 people in their prisons. And these people have been held for close to a year. They started with about 12,000. They ransomed them. These are their meal tickets. Because the people who have joined in the fight, especially in the last 2 months of the fight, when they saw that the fight was going to be a certain success, there wasn't going to be anything lost. The weapons were just piled up because Qaddafi used to buy all sorts of weapons. You could go into any open depots of weapons in the desert and pick up a Kalashnikov and declare yourself a member of this brigade or that brigade. And they wanted a share of power. And at a certain point, you had Tripoli itself was divided into 4 zones, other than the government zone, with each brigade controlling access and demanding payment, and on occasion fighting each other's out. And then suddenly we discovered that there was a transitional justice law, and the transitional justice law had been promoted by the Islamists in Libya, who wanted to use it as a way of ransoming people out of jail, who would then in turn pledge their loyalty to the Islamists. And in a tribal society like that of Libya, you get one person out, you have 100 votes that come with it. And so it became a whole political bag in addition to something of great financial consideration. Ideas about prosecutions, of course, fell by the wayside. Nobody is willing to prosecute. There were a lot of violations committed by, let's call them the Thawars, as they were called, or the rebels, against a number of people, particularly the Tawargas, who had been moved inland from the Qaddafi regime. These people have been displaced and strongly mistreated. Again, nothing happened there. On the Egyptian side, the idea of transitional justice, am I running? You're good. Thank you. On the Egyptian side, the situation is much worse, not likely to get any better. The early beginnings in Egypt were to maybe try to look at the violations committed by the Mubarak regime. That did not work out too well because the people of the Mubarak regime were still in control of the country. The then Attorney General Abdelmajid Mahmoud was appointed by Mubarak and a close friend of his, and he was the one who was supposed to prosecute him. And so, it was very interesting that Mubarak was prosecuted on a legal theory that doesn't exist in the Egyptian criminal code. And that is basically a theory of command responsibility for failure to act. And that doesn't exist in the civilian criminal code. And so while he was convicted at trial, he was acquitted at the Supreme Court level. Nonetheless, he was kept in prison. Now, of course, he is released because rightfully so, there's no basis for it. Nobody really borrowed to go after him for the major corruption of his time. His two sons, with all of the corruption they've been involved in, were prosecuted only for having bought 2 subsidized villas in Sharm el-Sheikh at a reduced price. So of all of their 20 years of corruption and multi-million dollars they made, this was the only charge brought against them. And so all of the 22 major corruption cases that were brought by the prosecutors of the former regime, nothing of this happened. So the whole thing collapsed. You suddenly have this very fast transformation of the elections, the reaction to the election, and so on. And the bottom line is this: on 21 August, just a few days ago, the cabinet in Egypt decided against having a truth commission or an investigation commission or nothing of the sort. There were 3 plans on the table. One plan was for a national commission. The other plan was a commission similar to Bahrain with mixed international participation. A third was for a commission of inquiry established by the Human Rights Council. All 3 were rejected, and the plan that was approved in paragraph 11 of the decision of the Council was to establish local committees of reconciliation. Nothing much is going to happen to it. The Muslim Brotherhood rejects it entirely. Instead, the Muslim Brotherhood is mounting an international campaign to seize the ICC on the ground that the killing of a religious group is a form of genocide, and if you don't like genocide or you can't make it work, make crimes against humanity work. So that's the new external campaign. So what you saw in the street is now giving way to a campaign for that justice. The new regime said we'll establish a Ministry of Transitional Justice, and then the judiciary opposed it. So the Minister of Transitional Justice could not become Minister of Justice as well. So he was shunted aside. It took him 3 weeks to get 3 offices in the former Senate building. And for all practical purposes, his entire work is being marginalized. At the Geneva level, HRC, Egypt, and the number of states supporting it are opposed to having a commission of inquiry. They're even opposed to having a special debate on Egypt in the Human Rights Council. There is going to be a general discussion of what is to happen. Not likely that anything much will happen. I'll jump from there to Syria. As you know, the HRC has established a commission of inquiry. First it had 3 members, then it had 5 members. With the exception of 1 member, Karen Koenig Abu Zaid, none of them have any experience in the Middle East nor speak the language. They have remained ensconced on the 4th floor of Palais Wilson in Geneva for a good year and a half. Recently, they have just taken a trip to some refugee camps in Jordan and in Turkey, and that is the extent of their fact-finding. Nothing much is likely to come out of that. There are efforts by some NGOs, including efforts by organizations such as the one led by Muhammad Abdullah and others, who are trying to obtain and collect evidence. That's both working out of Washington as well as Lyon, France. Another organization in London is trying to collect the data. There is a plan by these organizations to do transitional justice. There was some thoughts of that, and a plan was submitted to the GCC Council, which unfortunately did not gain much support. So the likelihood that there will be transitional justice at this point, in my opinion, is inexistent. If there is to be a Geneva meeting in September that will start the process of establishing a transition towards non-conflict, the first casualty is going to be transitional justice, because the reaching of a political settlement is necessarily going to involve making sure that Assad and his family, as well as the Alawis, are going to have some type of impunity situation. Memories of the Lomé Agreement will be there, though everybody has learned their lessons. It's not going to be put in writing, but it's going to happen sub rosa. So that's what it is. With respect to Yemen, the former president has left the presidency on the condition of getting an amnesty law. He obtained the amnesty law. There was some support of it in 2 resolutions by the United Nations, and everybody is eager to make sure that the amnesty law remains in place, because they don't want to have another sectarian war going on there. In the, if you will, up and down of peace justice, and instead of calling it peace justice, let me call it political settlement versus justice. This is the time at which throughout the Arab world the goal is reach political settlements, dampen the violence, restore normalization. We'll talk about justice at another time. The problems in the Arab world are economic, they're social. The problems of human development are very serious. Economic development are very serious. These societies are very unstable, and the risk of another revolutionary trend is very probable. This time, it's quite possible that the Islamists will find a way of communicating within all of these countries so that the next revolutionary wave will not be on a country-by-country basis. It will be a revolutionary wave that will be spurred by the Islamist movements and that will have connections between them, and thus much more serious impact geopolitically in the region, and from there possibly in the Gulf, with increased geopolitical considerations, particularly for the United States, with, of course, the big role of Iran to be played in the picture. So, transitional justice in all of these countries in which you have had a prior accumulation of violations which required some type of transitional justice, no matter what the mechanism is it a truth commission or other, is non-existent. May I say that also in all of that discourse, the one thing that I find rather, what should I say, I want to use the word deplorable of not hearing, is victims' rights. Nobody speaks of victims' rights, and that's what it's all about. And unless we start putting the victim at the heart of whatever initiative we want to take, it's not going to be enough for us to say well, let's try to prosecute. The prosecution is only a small part of it, and it cannot be the primary part. Prosecutions do not write the record of history. They do not right the wrongs of those who have been victimized. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cherif, for that incredible tour de force and slightly depressing assessment of the situation. I don't know if we'll be more uplifted or not by our following speakers, but I'm going to allow Greta and then Jamel to speak about their experiences. And you can either speak right from here or come to the podium. Sure, perfect. I think it's on.
Turn it on?
Yeah, it's on.
No, it's on? Yeah. So thank you very much for giving me the floor. creates suspicion among people. And so it takes some time to overcome it and create a relation of trust. The fact that these five organizations were somehow forced to work together for a number of months made it possible for them then to recognize the value of each of them, and then to work together afterwards and to continue working together also after the dissolution of the Commission itself. So I think these were two very positive aspects. Now, these are probably are not necessarily the most important parts, but I think they are positive aspects. At the same time, while the government, while the ministry was conducting this national dialogue, at the same time, other parts of the government were implementing a number of other measures that you would certainly recognize as transitional justice measures strict sensu. So one of that, for example, was partial lustration of the judiciary. Basically, without any process of transparency, without any previous notice, and without actually any process at all, the government came up one day in the spring of 2012 with a list of a number of judges that were dismissed from their position, without allowing them in the first place actually to even defend themselves, to even access their files. We know why they were being dismissed. And this, of course, created a perception in the population that it was unfair measures. Something similar is being tried by the government in relation to the politicians. The exclusion law is now being presented by the government and other political parties, and is still at the eyes of the Constituent Assembly. And if adopted in its original text, this would exclude thousands of people from their political life just because they covered certain positions in the various governments of Benin or in the political party of Benin. So, and again, without the possibility for the people to actually contest this exclusion. Now, the third measures that have been implemented is reparations to victims. I think this is the worst example, honestly, in the experience of transitional justice in Tunisia, because a number of reparations were provided to victims of the revolution, but also to victims of the previous regime. But the selection of the victims was totally arbitrary, was made by the government, and because a great part of the people that were of the Islamist party were, of course, oppressed during the Benin regime. Actually, the victims that did receive already compensation are almost only, together with those of the revolution, are only almost victims belonging to the Islamist party. This created a huge problem with all the other groups of victims. Now, as many of you know, it's very difficult in any country in transition to work with victims, because there are many different groups, and it's not always easy to find an agreement, certainly at the beginning of the transition. It's very difficult to put together different groups of victims. It takes time to recognize the victimhood of somebody else, and they all have legitimate claims. So this situation really created a situation of tensions between the various groups of victims, and we have found very difficult in our work to try to create coalition of networks that are absolutely necessary to help victims participating in transitional justice processes, not only in the phase of the preparation of the transitional justice process, but then later on, when the transitional justice process is actually being implemented, so to participate to the various conditions. Now, on the trials, unfortunately, it's quite true that on the side of trials, the government has not done much. We can, since the revolution of Tunisia has seen that it's been a place of recurring violence, which has not reached the level that is in other countries, but definitely at this point in time, it's definitely a worrying and dangerous So I think part of this is also due to the lack, the real lack of willingness of the government to provide any real form of accountability for past and present crimes. So there was only one trial convicting one former Minister of Interior for and his subordinates for torture. While torture was one common practice of the police under the Ben Ali regime, so to say it is still a current practice of the police. Then we have the military tribunals and a couple of trials in El Tef and in Tunis for the killing of civilians in December 2010 and January 2011. Now, I will not cite all the, of course, all the acquittals and the convictions, but overall, it was important that there was the conviction of former President Ben Ali for the killings, for complicity in the killings. And we'll come back in a moment on the complicity in these killings. But then the other, well, the Ministry of the Interior Ministry and the other high-ranking officials only were sentenced to from 10 to 12 years of sentence. And then many of them were acquitted. So, including the Director General of the Presidential Guard, and including a number of commanders in Tare and Castelli, which were the region where you could see the highest number of killings during the revolution. So it was really a shock for Tunisians. And now,
Greta, because I want to get to Jamel too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
So the lack of independence of the military is one of the reasons. Now, the other one probably is the legal challenge, which is the lack in the framework of the legal legislation, of some basic process that would allow them to actually provide accountability. And one of these is command responsibility. And I conclude with this last thought that I think the role of the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court Tunisia has ratified the Rome Statute immediately after the revolution is really to support this transition by serving as a model to provide legal reform and to support this transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Jamel has actually received several awards and has met President Obama as a result of his activism, which I've never done. I'm very jealous. As a result of his activism. Jamel, do you want to speak to what it's been like to be a human rights activist on the ground and comment on what you've already heard? Yeah, well, in the short version of the story, perhaps, so we have time to get to Roy as well. Thank you. It's on. It's on.
As you like to begin with poesy, I would like to begin my speech with poesy also. There is a part of poem of the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish that I find describe very well the Arab Spring. It says, I will read it in Arabic and then translate. يا دامي الكفين والقدمين إن الليل زائل لا غرفة التعذيب باقية ولا زرد السلاسل نيرون مات ولا زالت روما بعينيها تقاتل. Whom has the bloody hands and feet, the night will be over. Either the torture room, never the chains will stay. Neyron is died, but Rome still fighting. So, Friday, December 17th, 2010, there was like small crowd in front of the governor of Sidi Bouzid. Fruit vendor set himself in fire as a reaction against police repression and against corruption. So me and some activists, we just joined him in the hospital, and then they moved him to another city because the hospital had not enough equipment. When we get back to the city, we find the big crowd, and it begins like peaceful protests and spontaneous. That was not begun by political party, or that people go into the street. So we as activists, we lead that protests, and we wanted it to stay peaceful. We care about to keep it peaceful. And then we use social media, especially Facebook, to make the story known and to move other people in other regions so to protest. And that happened. And the January 14, 2011, the dream became reality, and the dictator left the country, and it begins like a wave of freedom, etc. But the problem is that the political class that stay after Ben Ali didn't understand very well the demands of the population, because the two major slogans were during the revolution. First slogans were for jobs. Employment is a human right. And second was for political freedom. Say freedoms, now president forever. So we want only few minority think in the right way that the political class should make just change the constitution through our experts, and to make election as soon as possible to guarantee this stability, because our economy is based on tourism and on foreign investments. So you need political stability to guarantee the development. But the big part of the political class wanted like a constitution council that will write a new constitution in like 1 year, and the same council vote a government, a transition government. What that happened on October 23rd, 2011, they vote that council, and the Islamic Party in Nahda and the two secular parties get the power, and they vote a government. But the problem is, this council played the role of parliament, and they passed even the year. Constitution is not yet written, and the government behavior like it's voted for like 10 years. So, and that was very bad, especially for the economy. Now, the major problem that Tunisia is facing, as Greta told about that, is the political violence. Political violence is practiced by the radical Islamist groups and by militia close to the ruling party, called itself the Revolution Protection League. And the two manifestation of that political violence, we saw two political assassinations. The problem is that groups using violence were never also, so there was no trial. The justice didn't play its role to stop them, and the government as well. So even, for example, in September 2012, they attacked the American embassy and burned cars, and that happened for the first time in the whole story of Tunisia that a diplomatic mission get attacked. But only 2 persons was detained, or 3 persons. So it looks like the government is encouraging that people to make violence. And there were not 2 but 3 political assassinations. The other guy, not with weapons, but yeah. So I think that's the major problem now. Concerning the transitional justice, nothing happened. Nothing. They just detonate some people from the former regime for like 2 years without a trial, which is illegal. Even in Tunisian law, it's illegal to detain people without any trial for more than 14 months. and then they liberate like 95% of them. And opposite, there are many corrupt businessmen or politicians who become more influent than before because they get closer to the ruling parties. That's it.
Thank you, Jim. You know, I'm very grateful, and I know the rest of your listeners are, to the courage, really, of all three of our speakers, and you, Jamal and Greta, for being on the ground where these things are happening. And Cherif, you've been on the ground almost everywhere where these things are happening. Roy, you have the final word, I suppose, and then we'll come back to Cherif and open it up to the audience.
Is it working? No?
Yeah, just speak up. You have to get close to it.
Now? Yes. That's much better. Well, okay. It is a great honor to be here and to speak to this distinguished audience, distinguished prosecutors. I will try to be brief in the interest of giving the audience the opportunity to also ask questions and interact with us. And one of the things that I think is evident from all the excellent presentations that we've heard today is the extent that issues of accountability and transitional justice are a part and parcel of, and are actually a major theme in what is happening today in Arab countries, and I think this is a very encouraging sign. I think it's obvious that accountability and the rule of law should be a key component in the transition of states away from oppressive regimes, and I think that the fact that we see that this is happening in the Arab world is something very important. Maybe before I will try to limit my comments to 5 points, to offer 5 points, speak about 5 specific issues that I think are important with respect to accountability in the context of the Arab Spring. But before I do that, I do want to acknowledge what also Prince Said said in the morning, that it is obvious that each country, each Arab country has its own, and we've heard it also from Professor Bassiouni, has its own specific history, its own special circumstances and the culture. Each Arab country is currently in a different phase of transition. In different countries, we've seen different types of human rights violations, and so it is obvious that there is no one solution or one size fits all approach to what type of accountability mechanism should be designed. But having said that, I do think that it is worthwhile to consider 5 points when we think about accountability mechanisms, about transitional justice in the context of post-conflict situations, and specifically in the context of the Arab Spring. One issue, I think, a first point that I can't resist making is the importance of recognizing the progress that has already been made. I've listened to my colleagues, and I think it's only natural that all of us, people that work in the field of international criminal justice, always want to achieve more and always want to have everything perfect, and there is never enough justice, right? You always want to have all the justice that we can achieve, and of course it is important and commendable. But I think it is also important at the same time not to forget that these processes take long time normally, and we are living through these processes. And it's true that in the era of internet and Facebook, we expect things to happen very quickly, and we can't be very patient. But that's not the nature of how these social processes happen. And I think that just the fact that I've mentioned, that today in Arab countries, issues of accountability and transitional justice are part of the conversation and are an important part of the conversation. And in some of the Arab Spring countries, we actually see things that are actually happening on the ground is very important, is very significant. It's not something that we could see 5 years ago happening. And so I think that that we shouldn't. I think we shouldn't only. We shouldn't leave here only with a pessimistic sense of, oh, you know, the situation is terrible. Yes, there is a lot that still needs to be done. Yes, there are many problems on the ground, but there is also progress in the sense of the consciousness that exists and the conversation in these countries. I think the second important point when we approach issues of international criminal justice and transitional justice is to have realistic expectations from what we hope to achieve through accountability mechanisms. And I think it is very important to remember that accountability mechanisms, international criminal law, cannot be expected to solve political conflicts. It can be part of a political solution. Absolutely, it can work in parallel to a political solution, but we can't put on international criminal justice the expectation that through an international criminal justice we will be able to solve a political process. And sometimes it is, and maybe this should bring me to the third point, that this raises the question of what is the appropriate time, what is the best time to have or to engage in transitional justice mechanisms, in accountability mechanism. What would be the time where it will be most effective to actually establish a particular mechanism? And again, sometimes we feel that, oh, it's very important that this will happen very quickly or as soon as possible, but sometimes, but there can be at least those of us that believe that these mechanisms are most effective when they are accepted by the national system or by the local community. There is also something to be said, and we want to rely in building these mechanisms on some cooperation with the local government or the local or the national society. There is something to be said also for having for the accountability mechanisms following a certain political settlement. It doesn't mean that this should always be the case. There can certainly be situations where it is necessary to have accountability mechanisms operating in parallel to situations of conflict, but it is not always very easy to achieve that, to have these mechanisms operating in such an atmosphere. So I think an important question is the question of what is the appropriate moment. The fourth point, and again I think is connected, is the question of to what extent we want these mechanisms to be based on domestic processes, and to what extent we feel that, you know, international or that a mechanism should be international or operated at the international level. And again, there is no single solution here, or there is no right answer. There are arguments why local mechanisms or mechanisms that are based on domestic law have some advantages. They certainly have the advantage of capacity building, and they would normally enjoy a greater national legitimacy. But again, it is not always possible. And so on the scope of possibilities, we're always considering possibilities between a national mechanism to having an international mechanism like the International Criminal Court, or some solutions in between of national tribunals or mechanisms that are supported by international, by strong international components, or an international mechanism that has a significant part of national participation in it. And of course, you know, the question of what is possible or feasible in terms of the design of such a mechanism really depends also on the political situation on the ground and what would fit any specific society. And I think the last point to make is the issue of maybe the idea that it's not all about criminal accountability. I think many times when we speak about accountability mechanisms, we speak about them with the sense of thinking or having in mind criminal accountability. And of course, we sit here with all the prosecutors. But criminal accountability can only be part of a solution. I think Professor Bassiouni mentioned it. It's not possible to through a criminal trial to bring about all the things that we hope to get in a process of transition of a society from a period of oppression. Criminal trials have their difficulties. They would normally involve a relatively small number of individuals. They can't always cover the entire history, or they can't deal with all types of abuses that happened during a previous regime. And therefore, I think it is very important to look in parallel to criminal accountability mechanisms to other forms of accountabilities, whether it is truth commissions or commissions of inquiry, or even other processes of political accountability and others. So to sum up, I think the main the issue of design of accountability mechanisms can be complex. I think there are important questions of timing and of what we really want, of our ability to achieve things through the national processes. And I think we are facing some of these questions even in these days with respect to some of the situations in Arab Spring countries. Thank you.
I think we've heard from all the panelists that the conversation has changed from what it might have been 10 years or 20 years ago, that the ICC has made a difference, that there is a conversation at least that maybe wasn't held prior. Cherif, maybe the first question for you, and maybe you want to respond. Has the ICC changed the equation? Would Egyptian ratification of the ICC change the equation? Have we made some progress? And conversely, did the perhaps negative experience of the Iraqi High Tribunal sour the Arab world a little bit to that kind of transitional justice mechanism?
Obviously, what we refer to as transitional justice has to be taken in its local cultural context. It means so many things to so many different people. And within the cultural context of different societies, it means different things. So let me say something that will be somewhat provocative. It's in Brenda's style, if I can say so. I'm totally belong to her school. And that is to say that the term transitional justice is in the Arab world a discredited term, notwithstanding all of the efforts of the NGOs and others, because two things. First, the word transitional modifies the word justice in Arabic, and that automatically rings wrong. There is no such a thing as a justice that is transitional meaning exceptional, meaning special, meaning between two different things. Second, because it connotes importation of an idea from the West. It's not an indigenous idea. The terminology is not an indigenous terminology. So while you will see a certain constituency for it, a constituency that comes from civil society, from NGOs, from human rights organizations that have particularly their links with the outside world, that's not the ring that rings right. If you go to a Muslim fundamentalist society, such as in Upper Egypt, and you talk about transitional justice, it doesn't make any sense. Now, justice makes sense. I mean, justice is innate. It's part of Arabic culture, of Islamic culture. It's part of human culture. It's something people can relate to. But things are not advanced in those, I want to say, simple terms. It suddenly gets complicated once you start talking about the mechanisms of transitional justice. In a sense, you know, you might remember that in Rwanda, there was this move for the popular gachachas and something popular, and in other parts of Africa as well. The notion of justice is more tribal. It's more family-based. It's more local-oriented. And to me, if we have to accomplish what we believe is transitional justice in the Arab world, it has to start with the victim. It has to be victim-oriented, because that depoliticizes the whole issue. And it's not because we are after so-and-so or so-and-so. Because there's another cultural factor which is very important in the Arab world. The Arab world is essentially conspiratorially minded. I mean, this is an intellectual deformation. I mean, if you look at two countries, Syria and Egypt, and Muhammad and his colleague will tell you, in Syria and among the Syrian expatriates and the coalition, you've got a conspiracy theory every day. You wake up with a conspiracy theory. You meet somebody and the first question is, what happened? And you know, and then somebody says, oh, you know, I read in the papers, somebody told me. There's always somebody who called me and told me something. And on that something, you build up a whole thing. You would be surprised. I wrote down, and I write reports on Egypt periodically called Egypt Updates. And in a recent issue, I just listed 14 different conspiracy theories. And they vary enormously, and they're frequently totally contradictory. So you talk about this type of transitional justice. It's foreign. It has a different name. What do you talk about? What sort of mechanism? Foreign. Who's foreign? Internal. Who is internal? Who is going to appoint? Before you know it, all sorts of conspiracy theories are building upon. So you've got to make a sort of a tabula rasa and start very basically, we are here because we are concerned about the victims. See if you can start something on a victim basis and then build confidence from there. One of the reasons why the three options proposed to the Egyptian cabinet were rejected was on a very simple proposition as the cabinet met and discussed. And the first question there was, and that would have been the first question in every Arab country, well, who are going to be the members of the commission? It's not going to be what's the process, how it's going to work, who's going to be on it, who's going to be the judge. And immediately everybody is thinking of who is going to be represented, and then comes the conspiracy theory, what's behind it, who wants what. Within 6 months of the January revolution in Egypt, there were 26 political parties. There were 26 candidates for the presidency. And you know, this is the type of context that you have to deal with. And that's why, for example, in Syria, and again, Muhammad and his colleague will tell you, one of the biggest problems that you have is the coalition is unable to get its act together because they're fighting with each other, fighting for the chair, fighting for personality, fighting for recognition. Why? Because Arabs are essentially individualists. They're extraordinary individualists. You take an Arab out of the Arab world and that Arab succeeds, man, woman, or child. You keep a brilliant Arab mind in the Arab world, that person will not succeed because the society is not a society that permits this type of success. It's a very individualistic society, a very individualistic culture. And part of that is the fact that it's a society that lacks discipline. And a society that lacks discipline does not know how to work with structures and institutions. And you've got to take these cultural factors into account when you're going to say, how are we going to build something that is going to acquire? So come back to the cabinet question. The cabinet question in Egypt was, okay, who are going to be the members of it? What's going to be the structure? How is it going to work? And after 4 hours of debate, the conclusion was, it's never going to work. Forget about it. Put it aside. Let's have these local committees, etc., etc. Muhammad, you and your group have an elaborate plan on transitional justice in Syria once Syria is liberated. Okay, I hope to see you in a year or two from now when Syria is liberated. If any of this materializes, I'll buy you a cup of coffee. So, you know, I mean, this is unfortunately the contextual reality. So we have to approach the Arab world in a much more imaginative way than we would approach another society.
Well, with that uplifting, I have to say, as most of you know, I am Arab American, and what you say about the conspiracy theories is totally true. Do we have some questions or comment from the audience, maybe? Yeah, in the back. Yeah, the gentleman who's there. And maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions just so we can go back to the whole panel. Yeah.
Yes, my comment to Professor Cherif, with due all respect, all actually the cultural elements within the Arab society is reflected the different political and sociological dynamics within the last 4 decades. There is no indigenous in the Arab society. That's been changed. But when the Arab society is under hard dictatorship, it's for almost 4 decades, and saying hard because there's some sort of dictatorship in Southeast Asia. 2 or 3 of these regimes never been changed only through military intervention from outside, Iraq, Libya, and Syria on the way. That's telling you something that all the tradition has been built within the society, all the institutions have been destroyed. This is why we have a broken society. It needs to be built, it needs to be, and this is not an easy thing. This is why the issue of transitional justice, even that's always been misunderstood in the translation in the Arab society, but I think it's widely been accepted, but it's needed leadership. What's missing actually in the issue of transitional justice, lack of leadership among the politicians, among the human rights activists, because they have to explain before to the society what that means. And the last thing, it's what succeed in Eastern Europe never been succeed in the Arab region, because in Eastern Europe there is at that time still the EU, which set the principles of each country need to join the club to make all these principles. In all the Arab world, the Arab League is non-democratic institution. This is why the GCC now is controlling the Arab Spring in Syria and now in Egypt. And within the conflict in the GCC countries, none of them are democratic countries. That will happen, and that's how we expected. And this is a responsibility always on the Democrats.
Thank you. We need to move to maybe one more question, then we'll turn back to the panel. One more question? Yeah.
I'm confused. Is it individual or tribal? Is it justice or revenge? I suspect it's all of the above.
All right. I'm gonna ask Cherif, then Greta or Roy, if you have any final comments, and then Jamel, you can conclude with the poem or not, as you.
There certainly is a problem of a sectarian nature, but what has happened throughout this so-called Arab Spring is, as our colleague here was saying, there was a breakdown of each of these Arab societies. And the internal breakdown basically broke down along unexpected lines. So in some cases, the breakdown is along Muslim sectarian lines between Shia and Sunni. In other areas, the breakdown is between those in the military and those surrounding the military in certain corrupt oligarchies and regimes and the rest of society. In other areas, you have royal families and the members of the royal families and several other segments of society. To answer the gentleman there, Libya is very much of a tribal society. But tribal society in a different sense, it's divided into 3 regions, and so it's the regional characteristic that prevails, and within the region you have the tribe, but it's not tribal in the African sense of the tribe itself, but it's the region. In Egypt, the breakdown has been along political, but also along religious lines. And yes, there is a danger for the Coptic and Christian community in general, particularly in Upper Egypt. But there, the problem, in my opinion, is not so much the Muslim Brotherhood as much as the Salafis, who are really spurred, not in this case, but in the past, by Saudi Arabia, funded by Saudi Arabia, who are probably quite extremists in their views, but also of some other extremist groups like the Jama'ah Islamiyya and others. And so you have a whole different dynamics there, which has nothing to do with the sectarian war going on in Bahrain, for example, or in Iraq, and to some extent also in Lebanon. So you suddenly realize that when the society has broken down, whatever was keeping the society together, you now find a totally fragmented society, and what you're saying is absolutely true. You need to reconstitute the society. One of the ways in which the regimes remain in power, and that is an example of the Assad regime, is precisely to fragment the society. How do you keep the Alawis, who are 10–12% of the society, in power is by fragmenting the society, by creating fear among the Christians and other minorities in Iraq. But tomorrow I will address the geopolitical considerations, which are very significant and tie in with that internal breakdown, so that you see a new realignment. Kurds in Iraq with Kurds in Syria and eventually Kurds in Turkey. That will give you a whole new dimension. Muslim brothers cutting across national lines, separated from the Salafis, supported by Saudi Arabia. And there, the name of the game is how do you protect the Gulf states, irrespective of the rest. So all of these dynamics are at play, and what I want to say is that there is a very strong innate sense of justice among the people in the Arab world, as it is among people in different parts of the world. But the way to activate, to move the sense of justice has to become from the victim side. You can't start from the institutional side because the institutions have broken down. Nobody has trust in the judiciary anymore. Nobody has trust in the police. Nobody has trust in the army. So how can you establish a mechanism that needs institutional support from a functioning state when the states are non-functional and the institutions are not credible?
All right, we are pretty much out of time, but maybe either Greta or Jamal, if you want to, Roy, if you don't mind, well, just because this has been so much a movement generated by the youth in your countries. Jamal, do you want to finish, or Greta? You can close, yeah, if you have any final thoughts.
I want to come back to the point of the cultural aspect in the Arab societies. The problem in the Arab societies that people want and need always this only man who did everything alone, and he is like a strong, charismatic personality. They are not so much used on institutions and on plurality, on many people who leads. You know. There is always this mentality of the leader. It was Khalifa, it was the prince, it was...
Okay, Greta?
I just wanted to emphasize the last point that was also made by Professor Bassiouni in relation to victims. I really do think that it's transitional justice must be victim-centered, and that in general, in previous countries, in other countries, victims have been included in the transitional justice process in the second moment, when there was the implementation of transitional justice. And the attempt of most of civil society was to include them, for example, before Commission of Truth or during the reparation phase. What has not been done really in a proper sense, in my opinion, is to include the views of victims and what they expect from transitional justice in a previous moment, to build the fabric of transitional justice. And I think that's one of the challenges that we need to really overcome rather than this mechanism really successful. Thank you.
All right. Please join me in thanking the panelists. And thank you. And our Master of Ceremonies.
Thank you very much. A few announcements before we move on the evening. First of all, Cherif, if you would like to have some more colorful Brenda-isms, so to speak, we can talk. I would just like to say that the reception tonight will be off the parlor, the room that we had breakfast in this morning, and I think that's the same room that we are also having dinner in tonight. Kathy has just informed me that there still are some seats and meals available for breakfast tomorrow morning and for lunch tomorrow. And so if you want to stop over to the hotel and try to get a meal purchased for either of those two times, that she said there still were a few seats available. Lastly, tomorrow morning for our year in review, we have, I believe, on the program that the year in review will take place at the Presbyterian Church, but I believe the description would be more appropriate to say Presbyterian House. And Presbyterian House is located right next door to the Athenaeum Hotel, and we can certainly tell you at our table where to find it if you have any trouble finding it in the morning. And so again, I want to thank you all for a wonderful day. I know that Roy was cut a little short with closing remarks, but Roy will be back at a porch session tomorrow morning. So you can certainly see Roy again tomorrow morning. So again, thank you very, very much today. The closing session after a while is going to be between a few of our prosecutors and many of the students that have come today around the porches, and the students very much look forward to this time to have a little time with our prosecutors. So again, thank you for coming, and I will see you all later.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to keep the train.